Welcome to the Oxydise podcast, where we explore the biology of human energy in the full spectrum of human health, from elite athletic performance through to navigating chronic illness and the technologies and lifestyle choices that support recovery, resilience, and long-term well-being. Today, I'm joined by Ollie Patrick, physiologist and host of the podcast, The Energy Equation. Ollie has spent the last 2 decades working in health physiology and lifestyle medicine, helping individuals understand how sleep, movement, stress, nutrition, and environments shape the energy we have available each day. What makes Ollie's podcast particularly interesting is that not just it's a conversation, but many guests undergo physiological monitoring beforehand, measuring things like heart rate variability, resting heart rate, stress load, and sleep quality, giving a window into how their lifestyle is affecting their biology. The central idea behind the podcast is simple but powerful, that our lives are essentially an energy equation where stress, sleep, movement, and environment either add or drain the biological energy we have available. So today I want to explore that idea in more detail and what human energy actually means at a biological level, and how modern life affects it, and how we support resilience, recovery, and long-term health. So Ollie, welcome.
The greatest intro of all time, Alan. I'm going to say, if I wasn't on this podcast, I'd be listening to it, because that's the scene setter, isn't it? That sets the scene. If someone has listened to that intro and they're not salivating with anticipation, I'll be
Well, I
amazed.
am on an individual level to speak to you, Ollie. So at least it's an island of one. So they can hopefully join us in that experience. So
Amen.
first of all, just to look at the importance of those markers. So I say HRV, and that could be a barrier for some people to know exactly what that is. And then, of course, some people have some understanding what sleep quality is, but it's then resting heart rate. So if you could break down some of those things for us. So looking at HRV perhaps first. And
Yeah. I mean, HRV, it's dinner party chat now, Alan. This was the preserve of the sort of physiological laboratory probably 15 years ago. Now it's, what, pass me the salmon, what's your HRV? And I think, HRV stands for heart rate variability, and it's become a markedly democratized health parameter because it's the engine room behind most, large scale wearables, i.e. Whoop, which I wear, or Aura rings. Watches will have a body battery capability that's driven by HRV. Apple Watch captures HRV, and it sort of moved out of the shadows into a mainstream physiological parameter without anyone often going, what on earth does it mean? So heart rate variability isn't actually that interesting. It's the sort of beat to beat variation on your heart rate. So if your resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute, your heart doesn't beat once per second metronomically. It will bounce around. Sometimes it speeds up, sometimes it slows down. And that variability is what's being captured in this HRV metric, with a view to saying, if I capture that variability, I can look at the nervous system that's influencing it, which is something called the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is the biological system that controls all the things we can't be bothered to think about. What's my heart rate? What's my blood pressure? What's my temperature? What's my digestive activity? And it makes sure the inside of my body is regulated to match the demands of the outside world in a process that people might begrudgingly recall from biology called homeostasis. That was again, one of those lessons people tried to skip. Homeostasis is you and I, you're in an ambient environment, do you need to sweat? Do you need to shiver? You might have eaten some food, nourishing food, knowing you, Alan, so, are you digesting that food and breaking it down or not? So all these automatic biological processes are regulated by this nervous system. And in really simple terms, HRV gives us a window to look at whether that nervous system is more prepared for threat and stress, or whether it's more internally prepared for rest, energy recuperation, and digestion. And as a human entity, those are sort of the two extremes that we can be ready for. I could be, fleeing through the jungle, hunting or running from something. And biologically, that's very different in terms of high heart rate, high temperature, nothing's in my stomach, eyes are nice and dilated, and I am a real different physical specimen to me sitting with loved ones, laughing, eating food, totally in a deep state of relaxation where my heart rate's low and my gut is secreting all the things I need to break down food. And these wearables are basically going, Ollie, do you look more like you're running through the jungle, or do you look more like you're chilling out with friends? And the great danger is, of course, in modern society, people are sat chilling with friends, but their physiology looks like it's ready to run through the jungle. And so heart rate variability has become a way of trying to quantify this idea of stress and recovery It's also a metric that correlates with sleep staging and sleep recovery. So it's increasingly used as part of the picture of how well am I sleeping and why am I not waking up refreshed, or why can't I fall asleep? And it's sort of part of a growing toolkit of things that have become markedly democratized in terms of brilliant wearables capturing rolling data on me. Think back in the old days, Alan, I probably, to get any health data, it'd be every 2 years. I'd get this singular snapshot of myself. And I've got this Rolodex of rolling information, of which heart rate variability is a central component to help individuals make a decision about, am I managing stress? Am I managing the pressures upon me? Am I building sufficient time for rest and recovery? Is my sleep restorative? When I move, is the volume of movement and the intensity of movement adequate to disrupt my physiology in a positive way? And it's really feeds into this idea that, same as my podcast, you're trying to hyper personalize lifestyle so that it's effective. That's the general idea. Resting heart rate are sort of separate parameters to a degree, but similar thing. It has a meaningful correlation with heart health and potential states of stress. But it falls back to this idea of, you and I don't want to follow general guidelines, right? We're rebels, the pair of us. You're more of a rebel than I am. You're a disruptor.
I
You
don't know about that.
know,
Yeah, I probably drink more alcohol than you, and that's maybe the limit of my
you're a rebel.
rebelliousness.
But we don't want, 150 minutes of government cardio and two weight training sessions a week and 5 portions of fruit and veg. And,
Yeah.
we know the guidelines, but I want my version. You want your version. And that rebel heart wants data-led, hyper-personalized guidance that confirms that what I'm doing is right, or reshifts my direction, or is something I can use, put in my back pocket and pull it out when I need it. So I'm a big believer in those metrics, but only when used appropriately and intelligently.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And one concept that I feel sometimes when I've watched your podcast is, or are thinking, like, is the kind of, there is a collection of this particular physiological data, and then there are people that transcend that data. So we are not the limit of that data. And I wonder if you could speak somewhat to that. So people go out, to your knowledge, and the people you've met have gone out and done extraordinary things, yet some of their HRV data may not be particularly exceptional.
Great question, actually. And something I'm surprised isn't explored more often, because, of course, my data doesn't tell me how I feel or how I function. It becomes part of the consideration. Right? If we take a sort of functional medicine model, I'm, maybe at least 17 different biological systems. So my autonomic nervous system, or my neurological system, is separate to my gastroenterological system, which is separate to my endocrine system, which is separate to my cardiovascular system. And of course, we are looking at one biological system and saying that that will be the determining feature in how I feel, which it can't be. The determining feature of how well I perform, which it can't be. I think a good example of that was the guy Ash Kane, who was sort of a super endurance athlete who was doing crazy challenges, back-to-back marathons. He did a triathlon the length of the country. He ran the length. He swam. No, he kayaked around the outside of the country. He cycled from John O'Groats to Land's End, and then he cycled back, and he did this thing. But he was doing all that with very little rest and almost no sleep. And you go, well, how is that possible? Because if he looked at his Whoop in the morning, it would say, don't do anything, right? You haven't recovered, you haven't slept, you are inadequately perfused with recovery. Yet he'll wake up that day and go and push out 56 miles of quality exercise, and then wake up the following day and do the same thing again. And here we have to understand that biology isn't the singularly determining point in performance, right? If we go actually to fatigue, which is an interesting area, you and I, if we went for a run, right, together, or a bike ride, the reason we stop isn't that our physiology has run out of the ability to combust energy. The reason we stop is our brain has received enough signals to suggest, this is now harming me, I think it's time to stop. So there was an old theory by a guy called Professor Tim Noakes, who you might know more in latter day as a sort of nutritional dividing rod, because he was the guy in South Africa who said, a woman said, what should I feed my baby? And he said, steak. Anyway, that's a separate podcast. But he was one of the OG sports scientists who said the reason we fatigue is central governor theory, which is my brain is monitoring biological signals of fatigue, and it's protecting me, so it stops me before I stop myself. And that's why if you listen to music, you can push a little bit harder. If you actually exhaust your brain with like brain training before you go and do a run, you'll run a little further, because you cut out that feedback loop of my body going, stop, Ollie, stop, and I keep going. So the idea of performance is so multifaceted. It's driven by more than one nervous system. It's driven by, multiple factors, from how much glycogen I've got in my muscles to my previous lived experience of, did I do it before and I believe I can do it again, to my emotional reward, my kids are waiting for me at the finishing line, to my central, my governance in my brain that says, oh, Ollie, ignore the pain. The old cyclist in Tour de France, what was his,
Lance Armstrong.
Lance Armstrong. But there was another one. There was a German guy, and he
Oh,
coined the
right, sorry.
phrase "shut up legs."
Okay.
And he effectively was saying, my legs are talking to me, and his brain is telling him to shut up. So shut up legs was his mantra. And that again tells us that for someone to achieve performance, it is so multifactorial that we can't ever say that that single parameter is a dictator of performance. It'll be a contributor to performance. And VO2 max is a good example of that, right? We both talk about VO2 max quite a lot, the objective measurement of cardiorespiratory fitness. So this is who's going to do best theoretically at a marathon or a Tour de France. And at the lower end of the spectrum, who's got such a low cardiorespiratory fitness, they may not survive complex surgery. So it's a really important parameter and increasingly visible in the world of longevity, where some data suggest it's the most important predictor of life expectancy as a number. But the person with the highest VO2 max isn't the best marathon runner in the world, because there's other factors like running economy, who's got the most efficient running style, and VO2 max, who can get to VO2 max and then stay there the longest, and who's got the best fuel dispensing mechanisms, and who's got the best psychological techniques, and and who's got the most mitochondria. There's all these things. And the great danger is people believing that the single device with a single view is a dictator of how they feel. And what we're increasingly keen that people understand is the way you feel must be or can be contributed to by data points, but not dictated to. And that nuance is difficult for the average person, Alan, who's probably quite disconnected from how they feel because they've put other things first, career or pushing or child rearing or being a carer for someone or just grinding. So they sort of get this sudden bit of wearable. They're like, oh my God, I'm tired. But the real question is, if I feel tired, can I use data to work out why, rather than can I put a device on and then believe I'm tired because it told me I am?
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's so richly kind of there's so many parts to it, but there's like the general rule of someone like David Goggins, who's a non-scientific perspective, but he'll say most people quit at 40% because he's got that intuition around where we roughly lie in terms of we're not running from a predator. So our brain tells us, why are we running at all? And starts to shut you down. I've always found from my own experience of long distance running, the first few miles, once my brain realizes I'm not in a fight or flight situation, it tells me I'm tired and should stop. But then whenever I check beneath the neck down, I'm sort of
Yeah,
do a systems check inside. I'm like, I'm actually coasting along here. I feel fine. But if I listened to upstairs, I would be like, oh, I'm going to end this in a mile's time. So I
such
definitely
a
find
great
that
example.
there's all that kind of intuition around those types of things. But when we look at energy and where it comes from at a cellular level and the kind of role that mitochondrial plays in overall health and longevity, kind of what could you speak to there in terms of the way energy is produced in the body?
So, I mean, at a simple level, there is, of course, physical and physiological energy. And I think it's important to note that that isn't the defining feature of all energy. We don't fully understand the human machine. We're pretty good, but we don't fully understand it. Why? And I'll take, for example, before I go into mitochondria, you'll find people with long-term fatigue disorders who are physiologically robust, right? So they cannot energetically get out of bed. They cannot, find the energy to go and do the things they used to do, and that could be post some kind of viral exposure. It could be a version of long COVID, or it could be a glandular fever, Epstein-Barr, or it could be some kind of traumatic episode, or it could be this, that, the other. And you'd look at those people physiologically and go, well, they've got all the component parts to manufacture energy, but they can't access it. And as much as and there'll be different iterations of different fatigue disorders where we just got to be careful that we recognize that there is also energy that comes from A, unknown biological rationale, B, emotional sources of energy, C, sort of psychological sources of energy in terms of motivation, growth, learning, and probably D, to this regard, broader spiritual types of energy, which is not necessarily about faith in God, but about purpose and fulfillment of purpose and what is required of me to access that energy. And when we find people who have no reason to have more energy other than it would be nice, it's sometimes a part of the strategy is to work out for what purpose would that new energy return value. I think from a physical energy point of view, of course, we'll all go back again to that other biology class, which was the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. And within cells, amongst the cellular structure, cells that produce, create biological benefit have mitochondria, which are little batteries, basically. They're the batteries in which we manufacture the unit of human energy called adenosine triphosphate. So humans are full of these tiny molecules of adenosine triphosphate that effectively, I always picture them like a Christmas cracker, Alan, because they've got, again, 3 phosphate molecules, adenosine triphosphate, clues in the name. And basically, to produce energy, one of those phosphate molecules snaps off. So if you're watching this rather than listening to it, you'll see me doing a very good, I'm pulling a Christmas cracker. And there's always a massive stitch up, who gets the good bit of the cracker and who gets the dodgy bit. So effectively, humans have got this ability to combust energy by pulling this cracker and we get a bang. And then we've got enough ATP for just a few seconds of energy. And then the body needs to put the P back on the sort of, it needs to stick the cracker back together. It puts the individual phosphate back on adenosine diphosphate to give it a chance to pull again. And this, again, will lead us to why things like creatine monohydrate is a huge source of potential energy, because creatine, again, can provide a phosphate molecule that glues that back on more quickly. So again, when we understand ATP, you'll actually end up starting to understand mitochondria, and then you'll start to work out why everyone's on creatine, why everyone's doing red light therapy, why increasingly people are talking about hyperbarics. Because here we're talking about the physical unit in which I create the very thing that drives all the cells and actions in my body. So the mitochondria will have the ability to convert oxygen and glucose, or oxygen and a fuel, into ATP. And this process of oxidative phosphorylation or cell respiration is the very thing that keeps humans on this planet. And we basically take oxygen from our environment, put it together with a fuel source, which is normally a glucose molecule, and then we go through a series of chemical reactions and we glue that P back onto the ADP. And that's what we do. That takes place in the mitochondria. And why that's relevant is because mitochondrial quality then becomes potentially a discerning feature of how much energy I could combust, right? So if we looked at a marathon runner, what would we see in the cells of their body? Well, we'd see more mitochondria. We would see more battery producing capability, which makes sense, right? Because if we think about what they're doing, they're producing more energy than I could. They are a nuclear power plant compared to my old school coal powered unit. So mitochondria have become a sort of therapeutic target, because people have recognized that in performance, having more mitochondria of a better quality could be a rationale for producing more energy, which means more performance. But there's a converse to that, right? Which this energy isn't just about running marathons. It's also the energy powering my immune cells. It's the energy powering my biological repair mechanisms. And so this lower mitochondrial volume and quality is increasingly being viewed as something that could contribute to aging and could ultimately be a sort of therapeutic target for enhancing immunity and being a true longevity intervention. So as much as people don't want to talk about mitochondria, we sort of have to go back there a little bit, because that's why people are talking about infrared and red light and NAD and creatine and hyperbarics and oxygen, because on a cellular level, this is the way in which humans exist. And we are trying to target that particular mitochondrial unit as the thing that we think could unlock more energy. And that gives the end user their version of a benefit, one would hope.
Mm. So it's fascinating, the creation of energy. So from your kind of experience, what are the kind of modern environment aspects that are suppressing our biology and lowering our energy and even contributing to chronic health issues that we're seeing today?
You're going to go the low-hanging fruit, Alan, and go, look, ultimately, Geoffrey Diotre, who I think was a French philosopher. This is the cleverest thing I could ever think to say. Everyone needs like a poem they remember, and a French philosopher they can quote once, and makes you look 10 times more clever than you actually are. He said, the human machine is the only one that winds its own springs, right? And human physiology is extraordinarily unique in terms of it's constantly calibrating its capability, the environment it finds itself in. If my environment goes from, I used to have to walk a mile to get my water, and now I need to walk 10 miles to get my water, then I will adapt to grow a bigger heart, more blood vessels, more blood, stronger muscles. I basically create the infrastructure to allow me to do the thing that keeps me on this planet. So the more movement we participate in, the more biological capability we have to move. Conversely, the less movement we have, the less biological capability we have to move. And so your biggest enemy of mitochondrial health is a sedentary lifestyle. really, on a basic level, because being sedentary is basically saying to your body, this is what I need from you, and over time it will just down regulate all its capabilities to that. It's, you're a esteemed businessman, Alan. If you had a whole load of employees who didn't do anything, what would you do with them? You'd make them unfortunately redundant, because that you wouldn't pay an asset that has no value to you, and nor will my body pay multiple capillaries and excessive blood and excessive muscle that do nothing. So the body is a fairly stern employer, that if it's sedentary, it will downregulate its movement capability to match its demand, and that's a big cost. We also, when we look at mitochondrial health, we have to recognize there's a series of sort of enzymatic and chemical reactions going on in there, many of which have cofactors that require what people would describe as micronutrients. So when we look at the sort of cascade of biological actions that take place in what's called the Krebs cycle, for example, which is the way in which we turn that glucose and oxygen molecule into ATP, you'll see in there the need for vitamin B1 and vitamin B2 and vitamin B6. And you'll see in there the need for magnesium. So the average person eating a diet rich in ultra-processed food, devoid of those diverse nutrients, predominantly born from quality plant-based foods, doesn't have the molecular sort of ingredients to make energy. So we have this sort of idea of what's the bottleneck? Is it the fact that I didn't have adequate movement levels, so I've got less mitochondria? Is it the mitochondria themselves are being inhibited because there's a lack of abundant nutrition to make those processes roll through? Is it that there are some potential toxicity question marks over elements that are hindering? Is it a lack of oxygen? Is it a lack of available glucose because I've created a toxic environment through having too much glucose through excessive body adiposity and weight over the years? But when we go back, it'd be madness to think about mitochondrial health before we think about getting my equivalent of 8 to 10,000 steps a day, getting my government guidelines of physical activity, particularly the cardiovascular exercise, 150 minutes a week. It'd be madness to go past the idea of 5 portions of fruit and veg and 30 different plant-based foods over the week, because those are the foundations of which the cells require. And we just got confused, Alan, that those things were hobbies, or those things were about what I look like, rather than seeing the basics of those activities as being the way in which I fundamentally run the cells in my body. Sleep is, of course, the third leg of the table, but it's more of that clears all the opportunities for general inflammation and body rest and repair. But mitochondrially, it's movement, it's nourishment before we think about other things.
Yeah, we've got a slight vested interest in oxygen at Oxydise, so it's kind of an interesting kind of to look at sort of the general population. Okay, sorry, forgive me. We have a kind of vested interest of oxygen at Oxydise, so it's kind of looking at kind of the general population. There's not such a concern around sort of oxygen delivery to tissues per se, so it's instrumental at a fundamental level. Sorry, fucking hell. So we have a vested interest of oxygen at Oxydise, Ollie, and in the general population, I would say delivery of oxygen to the tissues isn't something people are so concerned about. But at a fundamental level, it's key to our sort of cellular energy production. You can know that from just holding your breath for a couple of minutes, just how important that is. So, what is it, to your knowledge, the importance of oxygen and even breathing techniques around sort of absorbing oxygen and changing the nervous system?
I think it's getting oxygen on the menu is a very logical thing, and who would have known that the brand Oxydise was working on this idea of oxygen delivery. But I think we need to put oxygen in the spotlight, because a lack of it is a major challenge to the body. I mean, I'm not a huge Gary Brecker fan, but he would say the absence of oxygen is death, and I think that's fair in many cases. We are running on this essential ingredient for human existence. And therefore, pathways that enhance oxygen availability are, of course, logical. And there's a couple of things there. From a breathwork point of view, clearly, most of my oxygen would come through, well, it all comes through my respiratory system. And when we go back to that heart rate variability, looking at the nervous system that gets me ready for threat, I've got quite a different respiratory pattern in a threat situation than I do have in a sort of calm dinner party. Pass me the, well, we could say pass me the something. Let me do that whole bit. I was going to say, pass me the
Okay.
weed.
The weed. Oh
Pass me the
God,
weed.
Ollie.
Was it?
It's all
Because
right.
I
I'll never
can't
let
say
this.
alcohol.
Yeah,
So when we think about breath work and the respiratory system, we can go back to that example of the heart rate variability, looking at that autonomic nervous system, because I breathe differently if I'm running through the jungle or facing threat compared to if I'm a lovely, relaxing, socially engaged dinner party, right? If I'm in the chill breathing zone, hopefully I'm breathing nasally, and hopefully as I breathe in, my belly would distend and retreat as I'm breathing diaphragmatically. And that creates a much better chance for me properly oxygenating my tissues, partly because as I breathe nasally, I infuse that air with a bit more nitric oxide, which is something that helps dilate my blood vessels. So nasal breathing, slow breathing, belly breathing, extended exhalation, that's the dinner party chill dolly. Running through the forest, fleeing the foe, I might move that breathing from nasal to oral, which is not where I should be breathing. And suddenly I'm breathing upper respiratory rather than belly. So my chest is fine. I'm panting because I'm basically able to very quickly, get a rapid dose of oxygen to my tissues and upregulate my body's ability to escape danger. But that isn't a particularly effective way of breathing long term. And we look at people sitting at their desks and in various office environments, and they look like they're breathing as if they're running away from something. And so that sort of feeds into the narrative that are we less perfused with oxygen than we should be just on a daily basis. We add to that a lack of, L-arginine based foods like beetroot or quality nourishment, which would help dilate my blood vessels. And we've got this sort of overtly inflammatory, constrictive existence. And, is it that the oxygen levels in my tissue is lower than it could be if I was eating a nutrient-rich diet, breathing effectively, nasally and slowly? The general theory with that is yes. And really that's still mostly theory. There'll be some good data that will be at the likes of Jamie Clements, who runs the breath space, or Jacko, who's again David Jacko Jackson, who's a specialist breath coach for athletes and other areas. These guys are out in the field driving increased awareness of breathing in a functional environment, as in how you and I are breathing now, but also in a dynamic exercise environment, and also actually using breath work as a way of modulating mood state through, real almost non-talking therapy. So breath is number one, but then we end up back at Oxidise's wheelhouse, which is, well, if oxygen is so good for energy production and so good for all these things, what if we could find a way of putting even more oxygen in? Because in most cases, people are rate limited in their oxygen, not by breath, not by heart, but by just the ability to carry it in their blood, right? So oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and that's the element in our red blood cell that moves it around the body. And you and I, bonded over many things, but we bonded over the love of hyperbaric therapy, being able to get more oxygen into your bloodstream than could be carried on that hemoglobin molecule. And therefore, if oxygen is good and oxygen is healing, then what would the hypothesis be if we could put loads in? And that hypothesis seems to be showing increasingly as a valid way of improving energy, but also a multitude of health benefits. But maybe I've jumped the gun talking about hyperbarics.
No, I mean that again, the dichotomy there between nasal breathing and mouth breathing, because that's where a lot of people have become there, as you say, in a sedentary lifestyle, not exercising to a maximal degree. We've become sort of mouth breathing, which has even changed the contour of our faces over time from our ancestors and the jawline, which is an interesting aspect to it. But
Yeah.
switching from the oxygen side to light, I had the good fortune in the last few weeks to go and meet Glenn Jeffrey, who's an expert in red light, a neuroscientist who's actually come to prominence through his sort of studies and experiments in red light and the data he's collected. And I sat in his office for a few hours and we kind of broke down a number of the things that he's been working on. But he feels like one of the big proponents of ill health in modern times is LED lights in office spaces and the like. We actually appear white, but they're a blue light, but are covered by some phosphor layer that we interpret as being white. But that he believes is accelerating aging and breaking our kind of circadian rhythms and just sort of very unnatural to our biology. I just wanted to speak to, because even in the last few weeks, or the last few days actually, we've seen some really, really bright sunny days. And even our groups of Oxidise, one or two people have been saying how much better they feel just from getting out in sunlight. So I wonder if you could speak somewhat to that as the kind of low-hanging fruit of access to just go outside, what natural light does for us in terms of exposure for our biology and our energy.
It's nature's normally put the solution in front of us. I mean, there's a seasonality which is difficult. We got we're recording this from the UK. We have seasonal affective disorder, which is a clinical disorder where mood is so low, it can be treated as a form of psychological distress through often winter dark months. And then we got the winter blues, which is like the subclinical level, which is everyone on the Oxydise professional team is sort of shaking off the winter blues. And you raised a really important word there, circadian. So circadian is the human's 24-hour biological clock, which is circadian in Latin means about a day. So we've got an about a day clock embedded into every cell of our body. And that clock is actually regulated by a master clock, which sits in the middle of our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. All fancy words, but we've basically got a light detector in the middle of our brain that's running our entire internal biology. And that light detector works on a couple of things. It loves rhythm. Right? So the first thing we look at, irrespective of light and darkness, is the human body loves consistent rhythm. It loves to know when it's waking up, when it goes to bed, because so many biological things are preemptive, right? So if I woke up at 6:30 a.m. this morning, my body knows I'm going to wake up at 6:30 a.m. So it starts a series of biological activations 2.5, 3 hours earlier than that to get me ready for 6:30 a.m. So before we even get to light, what we actually find is people are potentially confuse light with rhythm, because with new light comes an old rhythm, or with old light, so that's vital. But this 24-hour clock loves light and darkness. And the basic premise is, as humans encounter light, which we, observe through our eyeballs, as light hits the optic nerve, it basically is saying to the body, you better get revved up here, Ollie Patrick. So I start to manufacture, this stress hormone, which is the positive stress, cortisol, pre-awakening. I encounter natural light and I have an accelerated cortisol awakening response. And that basically is filling my body with a really important hormone that drives, vivacity, energy. The stress hormone is amazing for me. I just don't want too much of it too late, but I do want it. And then as that blue light sort of peaks, and ideally, I think that the theory is something like 10,000 lux of light in that first hour of waking, which would be probably 10, 15 minutes of bright overhead light, or half an hour in more overcast conditions, but there's still light there. And then as I go through the day, clearly that blue light would change, as in I go through midday, and then as light moves towards sunset and dusk, we get less blue light, more red light. And my body will also recognize that the air temperature would move from warmer to cooler. So a couple of things that would happen later in the day that would biologically prepare me for sleep is less blue light, increased red light, and a drop in my core temperature. And that would then begin the next cascade biologically, which is my body, again, reduces cortisol, it doesn't need it anymore, and it starts to manufacture melatonin, which again is going to enable me to move into sleep cycles and regulate a number of biological processes during sleep. So cortisol wakes me up, revs me up. Melatonin identifies depreciation of the day, slows me down, transitions me into quality slow wave sleep. Brilliant. But of course, blue light is a disruptor to that. So these LED lights are giving us a perpetual sunrise. So the latter half of that sort of series of events is challenged. And the data is mixed, Alan, right? Because everyone would love to go, oh, if you stare at an iPad, suddenly you've got a chronic sleep disorder. It's not as clean cut as that. One study did show meaningfully that if you encounter blue light devices, and that will be any LED device, phone, laptop, TV, whatever it is, within a certain proximity for a certain duration, you did have a suppressed melatonin production. So that was the smoking gun that everyone turned around and went, right, make blue light blocking glasses, and get the digital hard stop. We're not sure whether that suppression is because of the light, or also because of the confounding factor of what did I look at. If I watched a serial killer thriller, I'm going to suppress melatonin because I don't want to fall asleep in case that guy comes through the window. If I watch the news, I'm not going to want to go to deep sleep because it might be World War III by the time I wake up. So there's a difficulty separating light from content from stimulus, which just is it's worth paying attention to. But I think that the general principle here is our evolved biology is utterly confused by waking up in the darkness to go to work when it would never do that, by waking up and not getting any natural light in the first 2 hours, and then by trying to go to sleep in the presence of what it believes to be a sunrise. And so when you take 61% of the UK with a sleep disorder, before you go and see the respiratory consultant for a potential sleep apnea or a restless leg, you are waking up and go to bed at the same time, right? And you are waking up and then somehow, artificially, potentially in winter in the UK, getting bright light into your eye, and you'll find light boxes prevalent in that space. Or I have a pair of glasses called AO Wearable, which I put on and they pump that light straight into my eyeball. So are you enabling the circadian biology in the consistent wake with light? And are you enabling that circadian biology with a consistent sleep time, darkness, and cool? Because before you go and do the thing that you're seeing on TikTok for sleep, I hope you've got the foundations right. And so the other feature is, of course, light has a role in serotonin manufacture, which is, part of our feeling and happy. It's the wrong word, but, ultimately a hormone that is associated with mood, or neurotransmitter associated with mood state. So light is a double whammy. We stick the triple whammy in when we go light, of course, is a major conversion for vitamin D, which is also a mood modulator and also regulates my immune system. So with adequate light, I get proper cortisol release, proper circadian biology, I get proper serotonin, proper vitamin D. If I live in the shadows, I can't expect any of those benefits. And I might buy 25 supplements that aren't the right product because they weren't the original problem.
Mm. Yeah, and I was learning recently about the idea that essentially the branch sort of tree of all disease classification can come from a few core principles at say a level. So looking at say our metabolic dysfunctions or our mitochondrial dysfunctions.
Yeah.
Could you speak something to that idea and where you sort of stand on that? So principally there could be 10 or 11 things that are driving towards whatever disease classification later down the line could be sort of qualified.
It's a challenging bit, this, Alan, because medicine is an extraordinarily intelligent ecosystem, and I've worked
Mm.
in advanced medical clinics for many years and have absolute faith in the quality of the practitioners, particularly in the UK. NHS is an extraordinary healthcare system. The question that's often raised over it is, if I became unwell, why did I become unwell? That question, it doesn't really have scope to answer, and it doesn't like to hypothesize. If you turn up in an oncology department with a diagnosed cancer and say, why did I get this? Of course, no one can say why, no one would hypothesize why, but the individual does
Mm.
want to work out what might have been the reason that disease occurred, or why did I get a heart attack, or why have I developed neurocognitive decline like Alzheimer's when my siblings haven't? And and there's not as much what might be described as root cause analysis as would be wished by the consumer and also by the professionals, because they haven't got the time. They've got to treat the dysfunctional, uh, in pain, in distress individual in front of them. So with a very efficient healthcare system, we don't have a lot of time to work out why something happened and whether a central cause is the trigger for two separate things. So imagine I turn up in an endocrinologist office with too much glucose, but then I also end up in what would be a good example, in a gastroenterologist's office with a sort of inflamed gut. Would anyone link those two things to the fact that I am, have a addictive behavior around glucose-rich foods and refined carbohydrate, and that I am not sleeping at all? And that gets that idea of what causes what. And I think a lot of people, we're not clear on much of this, right? So we're spitballing without total confidence. But of course, much of disease is lifestyle orientated, not genetically orientated. And there's been a massive, we should do a separate podcast, massive backlash against the original data that said 20% of our disease is in our heritability, our genes, and 80% was lifestyle. And then someone has just done a big retro analysis of all the studies that contributed to those stats and said, actually, there's a rounding error that we didn't discount, unnatural causes of death, like car accidents, etc. And it's closer to 50%. So if I develop cardiovascular disease, is it 50% from what my mother and father gave me in terms of genetic material, 50% lifestyle, or is it 80%, 90%? It doesn't necessarily matter. That the 50%, 80% is the bit I control. So that's the bit I should lean into. And what we're looking at is, okay, lifestyle doesn't, of course, stop or cause disease. It's what's the biological impact of lifestyle. And when you said, okay, what's my best way of stopping you getting 155,000 different diseases? It would be, well, how many of those diseases come from this concept of inflammation, unwanted inflammation? And in fact, inflammation, the low level sort of immune response where the body is trying to protect itself but might unwillingly be hurting itself, is correlated with most major diseases in the world. And I say correlated because the person who says it's causative is probably just a little too bold at this stage in proceedings. But if I look at the commonality between a heart attack or cardiovascular disease, a neurocognitive decline, dementia, or some forms of cancer, and cancer with over 200 subtypes, it's very difficult to call one thing, but or a complex autoimmune disorder, in all of those would find excessive inflammation, excessive markers of the body's immune response potentially hindering processes. Now, does that mean inflammation caused it? Very difficult. But if you were playing the long game, wouldn't me being as low as uninflamed as possible be a strategic, logical play? Of course it would be. And then again, Alan, you mentioned metabolic disease, which in most cases is where people are unable. So when we think of metabolism, the construction of energy in our cells, we remember back that glucose and oxygen work together in that regard. So normally when people talk about metabolic disease, they're referring to an inability to keep blood glucose or blood sugar in an optimum range, and my body's ability to use insulin or detect insulin is depreciated, and now glucose is too high. And of course, when I have excessive glucose in my bloodstream, it creates inflammation, right? So and here again, you go, what's the first stone in the water that's causing all these ripples? And was it a lack of steps that meant that the diet I ate raised my glucose too much? That raised glucose over time created an inflammatory response, which allowed a particular nasty cell that would have once been killed and mopped up to then proliferate and become perfused, potentially. Where's the mitochondria play a role in that? Well, it's the energy to turn that process off. So you've got what was the biological trigger and what's my biological salvation? And the sweet irony of this is you'll end up back at the basics. That if I want less glucose, I want a more whole food diet, I want more daily movement, I want quality restorative sleep. If I want better mitochondria, I want more cardiorespiratory fitness, better quality diet. And so here we just find a compelling evidence base for the cellular benefit of exercise, nutrition, diet, sleep, stress management that could in a very complex way be determined as the sort of original causation of many of the things that go wrong with people, but critically not all of them, because there's so much we still don't understand.
Yeah, I'll be rewatching this, I think, Ollie, just to go through some of this again, because I always learn so much from you each and every time. This is like an oracle on these subjects. It's just so captivating the way you kind of synthesize all this information. It's fantastic. But and finally, kind of people listening today and some of the subjects we've covered, what are, say, 3 things they could do over the next 90 days that have the highest leverage return for them on their energy and their biology?
Um, get a hyperbaric, get a red light.
Yeah, of course. Standard.
But listen, I'm on this podcast because I actually think that the modalities that you are promoting play a vital role in this context. I'm being facetious, but I do think there are things to be considered for sure. But you've got to work out, have I optimized the basics? And the now potentially cancelled but ever resilient Peter Attia. Is that and again, there's a lot of people turning on his teachings because they don't like his moral or him as a person. But lots of what he said was robust, whether we believe what your personal thoughts are on him. And of course, he's made some atrocious decisions and has not lived a life of the moral value that many of us would associate ourselves with. That's all I'd say on that. But he used to say, people are majoring in the minor and minoring in the major. And in that regard, it's like, we are spending too much time. The majoring and the minor is focusing on little things that might have a tiny benefit, whilst the minoring in the major is I've ignored steps, I've ignored resistance training, I've ignored mobility training, cardiorespiratory training, I've ignored the vital role of multiple times in nature over the course of the week. I've ignored 1.5, 2 liters of hydrating fluids and clear urine. I've ignored 7 hours of sleep with bright light in the morning, darkness in the evening. And you just cannot outperform those things, Alan. And
No.
I can stick a wearable on you and slightly tailor the dose that you might get away with 6 hours 45 to go through full sleep cycling, or you might need 7 hours 45, or you might need 1 resistance training session a week versus I need 3. But the principles will be the same. The nuance will be marginal. And so we've got to first remember that our body is calibrating to its behaviors, not its beliefs, right? And by that, my mitochondria, my blood volume, my muscle mass is calibrating to what I do, not what I believe I do. So the work must happen, right? Finding technologies that enable stacking more work. If I'm going to exercise, could I then do my recovery with red light and compression? If I'm going to, again, lead a high demanding, stressful existence, can I use hyperbaric as a modality of my parasympathetic autonomic nervous system regulation? Yes, 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 and yes. But the minute you try and outrun the basics, you have misunderstood the way the machine that we live in works. And so I would say I love technology to augment behavior, to personalize behavior, but it can never outperform behavior. And so first individuals clean the decks, do the basics brilliantly. Second layer, which technology will enhance biological processes that I'm invested in? More oxygen, more mitochondria, better sleep, better restoration. What's my limiting factor? Therefore, what's my technology of choice? And thirdly, I believe in data to guide direction. If I do something, did it work? How many people base their entire well-being strategy of 20 different things on a perceptive feeling of being well? And you've just noted, Alan, everyone's well-being marker went up by 30% just because the sun came out, right? So this can't be a particularly efficacious outcome marker, because I might feel good today because someone said, Ollie, I like your chinos, and you're looking less grey than normal. So whatever it might be. So if we rely on subjective appraisal of well-being as our ultimate barometer, maybe we're on shallow ground. So that would be my sixpence worth.
Yeah, it's it's fascinating how the composition of this stuff comes together. But sorry, Ollie, what was I going to say there? I've completely lost my chain of thought there.
I've
Um,
thrown you.
yeah,
I'll need a wrap-up question.
yeah. Do you want to? Should we do another question beyond that, or wrap that up there?
If you can take a point from it, then you
Yeah,
consolidate, and then
yeah.
ask one last snapshot question.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's always comes down for me to this kind of ancestral alignment. So the things you mentioned there are the big levers, because then that's more organically where we've evolved from. And they're the responses that we have to these kind of inputs, light and the right kind of diet, the right kind of movement. And then I would say that what we do at Oxydise is it's existing and it's flourishing because we are out of that alignment so much. So as you say, they could either be the augmentation on the top, or they are fundamentally recuperating people as who are not able to engage in kind of more these ancestral kind of alignment factors. But yeah, with your experience of fucking hell, I don't know what to say as the last question. Feeling more autistic than ever today, I tell you.
You've done super. This is super. Done a
Uh,
brilliant job. What's the last one? Um, leave us with one. We've done the basics brilliantly. Leave us with one tip.
yeah, so okay, I'll go with this again. So it's always interesting because I kind of do find that it's being out of that ancestral alignment essentially is what we're talking in modern life. And this is why I kind of feel a company like ourselves is flourishing because of that. So we have these technologies that really do benefit and raise our biology. But if we were more ancestrally aligned, there'd be less of a requirement. It would just be the kind of icing on the cake, so to speak.
Yeah.
But in all of this then information today, what do you feel is one tip you could leave people with in order to sort of increase that energy and leave with a bit more vitality potentially?
I think your point there is the key one, right? From an ancestral point of view, we have built a body that matched our environment, but that body doesn't match this environment, right? So you didn't need half the things that we do, that you do 100 years ago in the same way, right? So we need red light to drown out the blue light. We need red light to backfill the lack of movement, the lack of nourishment. We need hyperbarics because we circulate oxygen so poorly in bodies that have sort of de-skilled so aggressively that we can use these advanced technologies to take old school behaviors and make them more effective. And I think my central point is well-being isn't a luxury market. It's now the skills you need to navigate a fairly catastrophic living environment. Your movement will be cannibalized, your diet will be accessible and poor, your sleep will be disrupted, your nervous system will be hyperstimulated. So you are now the custodian of whether you live well by making difficult choices that are not the path of least resistance across all the things we've looked at. I'd probably say if we spoke about one thing that's probably not in the common domain as much as it should be, it'd be light, the use of blue light, morning light, red light, infrared light. I think we were designed, your discussions that you've had at advanced levels, we were evolved in the presence of a circadian biology, finding modern ways of enhancing that biological system, to me feels like one of the most unexplored but highest yield areas. So as much as I love all the things that Oxydise do and etc., I think red light is a critical component. And the presence of more oxygen to a tipping point, but not a tipping point, would go past the presence of more oxygen should bring more available energy, should bring less inflammation, and therefore ways of enhancing oxygen, ways of managing light and being deliberate with your well-being would be my summary from today.
Fabulous. Yeah, as ever, I learn so much from you each and every time we speak, Ollie. So thank you. It's been a privilege today. And where can people find you? What would be sort of the best places to sort of find out a bit more about you?
I'm lurking on the interweb in many different corners. The energy equation is out there, as you say. They've got lots of interesting guests from international rugby players, Ben Earl to retired legends, Steve Redgrave. And again, I'm always interested in how people have chosen to manage their lifestyle. So the energy equation's out there. I've got the Modern Wellness podcast, of which I've had the esteemed Alan as a guest on there. So
Yeah, I remember
uh,
that.
you did a goodie on there. So that's a sort of industry newsletter speaking to people who are in this field who want an update on the latest stories and the latest trends and my view on what's robust and not. And I try to be as agnostic and fair as possible. I've got a website, www.oliverpatrick.com. And I'm lurking. I'm lurking. I'm on Instagram. I'm a borderline influencer, and I've got 8 followers now, so that's good news. But yeah,
Yeah,
principally, I'm in the ether, but really the podcasts are probably the best way of long form discussion like this, where you can actually get into the meat of a topic, and I think that's really valuable. So my thanks to you for setting this up and some brilliant questions, which have been fun to explore together.
fabulous. Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, and thankfully you're not like a tier in the files, so that's an area of the internet you're not lurking in. Thank you very much, as always. Well, thanks so much today, Ollie.
Pleasure, my
That's
friend.
it. Take care.